Welcome back to the show. We're talking about China's relations with the United States as President Trump gets ready to mark his first year in office. Joining me now is Scott Kennedy. He has been traveling to China for about 30 years, and he's the director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. With us too from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He is a political analyst for China Radio International. And also with us in the studio is Sourabh Gupta. He is a senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to all of you. Scott, we just heard Ambassador Xu there talk about the importance of the trade relationship between the United States and China. Yet it comes against a background of threats being expressed by President Trump that the United States will impose tariffs on Chinese imports, complaints that it's not a level playing field, that there's been currency manipulation. One way of looking at this is that that's meant for a domestic audience. It's political. How do you see it?
I think the president means what he says, and that Ambassador Xu in the piece before that we started talking emphasized the importance of cooperation. And I think from the American perspective that China's not been cooperating enough, and that Chinese industrial policy is unfair, and this needs to be addressed, and it's been a problem that we haven't been able to address for a long time. And that he's not just trying to play to his base or certain domestic audiences. Oftentimes people think his bite's worse than, not as bad as his bark. But I think in this instance, we're likely to see him follow up his words with actions in the coming weeks and months.
When you say with actions, when it has to be addressed, will it be a confrontation?
Well, I expect the United States to conclude the variety of investigations that are currently ongoing, conclude that China has been playing unfair, that this is harmful to the American economy and national security, depending on the investigation you're talking about. And then the president take a variety of measures involving tariffs, quotas, Chinese investment limitations, perhaps relations policies on government procurement, a full range of things that I expect to be implemented eventually in the coming weeks and months. So those that expect this to potentially go away or the president to get distracted, I think that's wishful thinking.
Okay, let me go to Qinduo Xu in Beijing. Qinduo, what's the view from Beijing? How does China address these concerns expressed by the United States?
Well, if you take a closer look at the Chinese policies since late last year, you see a series of opening up the market to the outside world. So China is actually, continuing to opening the market to investors from the United States and other parts of the world. And of course, the United States tend to see this on their own terms. This is not enough. China is not doing enough. Things like that. But then, everybody is waiting whether there will be basically sanctions imposed from the U.S. side on the Chinese investors, on the Chinese basically trading activities this month or later, in February. But the thing is, like, if there's a trade sanctions, measures like that against China, the Chinese side probably will be forced to retaliate. The thing is whether we will solve that problem by having a trade war. I'm not sure we will be able to solve the problem. I think the solution is still really is about talking to each other to find the concerns of each other, whether we can compromise and make concessions for each other to further open the market. To if you look at the recent U.S. activities, say the rejection of the Chinese investors from Alibaba and Huawei. So many people here see that as an example of the protectionist policies, under Trump administration.
Sourabh, of course, I just want to turn away from trade issues for a moment. These two countries also have one big diplomatic security interest, and that is the nuclear program being pursued by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In the year ahead, do you see that being resolved by cooperation between the two big powers, China and the United States?
No, I don't see it being resolved as such, but they are fortunately so far on the working off the same sheet. And to that extent that they can stay united and maintain a united front is useful. Of course, both parties are seeking complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament, denuclearization, And that is the standard position of all the countries within the six-party talks, as well as of the international community. But we also have to be cognizant of the fact as to how far both of them see each other as partners. I'm talking US and China with regard to Korea, and how far China can go along with the US position. Here's where the divergences are. US does not rule out war to resolve the Korean Peninsula. That is a total, complete no-no for China. That's one. The other area where there is the divergence is that China is not willing to support externally aided collapse of the North Korean regime. And the US would be happy, in fact, if it worked out that way. Of course, there would be destabilization. So what we will see is the two parties working together, but up to a point, and we would and should hope that these initial inter-Korean talks will blossom into something more, that we can get a more broader dialogue format kicked off, and that process proceeds on a more productive track.
Because the US view, Sourabh, is that China can do more. We've been hearing that from the United States for a long time. Does China see it the same way?
China could do a bit more, but not that much more. I think there is still some space in terms of oil sanctions, which China could impose and will impose. There's also some degree of enforcement of existing sanctions where China can go along and up its game a little bit. But I don't think it's going to be much more beyond that. And I think the Chinese at this point of time will also be pressuring the US that even if you don't fully accept the freeze for freeze proposal, you must be a little bit open-minded in that regard. You know, when Kim Jong-un spoke on New Year's Day, one of the objections he put forth was he has real issues with those military drills, but what he called were the strategic, the nuclear warfighting drills within those military drills. If the US can reduce the strategic component within those military drills and make them just conventional war exercises, that itself can be a small signal that the US can be a little flexible even on the military side. And it is these sort of flexibilities that China is going to pursue, because the UN resolutions, of course, punish North Korea with sanctions, but they also talk about parties it urges the parties to sit together and try to hash this out at the diplomatic table.
Right. And Scott, looking ahead, getting back to trade issues, looking ahead for the year 2018, you know, as Qinduo Xu said, China is addressing some of the issues raised by the United States. But at what point will we see US action? I mean, is there some kind of point where the US and China will be on a path to confrontation?
Sure. Well, it takes two parties to have a trade war, like any type of war. So I would think that the U.S. is probably likely to take steps in the next few weeks and months, not all at once, but step by step. And then it depends how China responds. The U.S. view, not just the Trump administration, but general observers, is that even though there have been some small steps that were cited, liberalizing announcements that eventually the financial markets will be open. But broadly speaking, China's foreign investment environment is far more closed than just about every other country in the world. Industrial policy is still operating at full steam. We're going to see U.S. action. I think the challenge is that the trade conflict is now described as a structural problem, a systemic problem. Usually economic issues, you can kind of cut things down the middle. You take this percentage, I take this percentage. Now the argument seems to be that this is so systemic, and of course the Chinese are defending the justification.
But does that rise to the level of a war?
Well, it rises to the level of a tit-for-tat, spiraling trade conflict, and hopefully not beyond that. But generally right now, the macroeconomy globally and in the two countries is pretty strong, right? And so markets are not pricing in the possibility of a trade conflict of it spreading. If that psychology changes, then this becomes a much bigger issue.
But as we heard Ambassador Xu tell us as well, that both sides will get hurt here.
Oh, indeed. Well, I think the U.S. view, at least among the Trump administration, is that jawing hasn't brought the benefits needed, and that therefore you have to back that up with significant pressure, including unilateral actions, and that maybe in the short term, both sides will suffer, interest groups will suffer on both sides, but the longer-term goal is if you can get structural reform in China quickly enough, then the pie for both ought to grow, and then you would have a healthier relationship and also improve the global economy. to reduce the role that industrial policy plays in the global economy, so improve global productivity as well. So yes, there's that trade-off, and it is a risk, but that's the logic.
Qinduo, how will China respond? I'm presuming there are possibly two kinds of responses here. One, China can meet some of the demands that the United States is making. The other is that China could retaliate with punitive measures of its own.
Well, I think primarily China usually is basically will compromise, will reserve in terms of retaliation. For the Chinese side, stress very much about stability and a successful China-U.S. relationship. And if you look at the China-U.S. trade relations, the Trump administration talked a lot about the imbalance of trade, the surplus and deficit. The thing is, like, if you look at the Chinese U.S. export to China, besides the agricultural products and some of the electronic products probably, and the non-high-tech products, and not many more the U.S. can sell to the Chinese market, which is growing rapidly. And the Chinese market, retail market, is supposed to be the largest to surpass the U.S. In 2018. So there is a huge demand for U.S. products, which are usually very popular with the Chinese consumers. The key is like how and what the U.S. are going to sell those products to the Chinese side. So this will help reduce the imbalance. I don't think there's any intention like not to buy the U.S. products. And this is a structural. Chinese side is a producer, the U.S. side is the buyer. So that's why you see the huge imbalance. I think the Chinese side recognize this is a problem. This is also not sustainable. We should solve this problem by working together. And secondly, in terms of retaliation, yes, the Chinese side, does have a few cards in their, up in their sleeve. What about in the soybeans, wheat, things like that? China can, of course, turn to other countries like Brazil, Argentina, other countries to purchase.
Sourabh, I've got about a minute left.
Yes.
How significant was that designation of China being a strategic competitor in terms of the relationship of the two countries?
It's a little hard to say because, yes, it has ever since the late 1990s, we've had this debate, a pitch debate, is China a strategic competitor or a strategic partner? And people have accepted that it's more strategic competitor. It was written formally that it's a strategic competitor. But the interesting part I would just point out is the national security strategy talked about China being a revisionist power. When Donald Trump talked about it, he talked of China being a rival power with whom we hope to fashion a productive relationship. So how much the national security strategy reflects what Donald Trump thinks, and in foreign policy, the president, is very important, what he feels. There is a gap between, and we should see how Donald Trump proceeds rather than what the strategy says.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us.